Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Dammmn Canada video by me, Dee Dee. I want to give a specific trigger warning before we jump right in. I am going to be telling the story of the Belcher Island Massacre, as it is known. This massacre was amongst the Inuit people, old, young, and in between. And I understand that there are some Indigenous groups that don't view photos of people after they have passed. So to be as respectful as I possibly can, I will not be including any photos of any people that are in today's video. This story is from the 1940s, so most, if not all, are now deceased, but there may still be some relatives around that may end up watching this video. I also wanted to add that if this story is part of your family's history, I mean absolutely no disrespect in talking about it. I specifically just wanted to cover this story because it seems that very few people know about it. But that being said, because the story is the Inuits, I've tried my best to use the Inuit names for land and such, and I will be translating as I go and putting some of the words and names on the screen so that you guys can see what I'm trying to say if I do end up messing it up. But that being said, I don't speak Inuit, and I'm not an expert with the dialect. So even though I have done tons of research and just into like the definitions of the words and the proper pronunciations, I may slip up, I may make some mistakes, but please know that I am trying my absolute hardest to use the proper language and pronunciate as well as I possibly can. But if I do say something wrong, I really encourage you guys to type out the correct way that it's pronounced or something like that, because that's the only way for us to learn. My number one goal with this piece is to bring awareness to what happened in history and educate as much as possible, along with bringing the utmost respect to this subject. I can't stress enough how much intent I had on making sure this video was as respectful as I possibly can make it. This video touches on the subject matter of massacres, cult-like activities, and religion. So if any of these are triggering for you, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up so you have time to click out of this video. And thank you so much for clicking. I hope I see you guys again soon. So today we're going to be traveling all the way up to the very cold Hudson Bay onto an absolutely amazing looking archipelago, which means a group of islands that are known as the Belcher Islands. But this is not just one island. This area is made up of actually 1,500 islands, and they're divided by narrow straits of saltwater. So on a map, the Belcher Islands is geographically closer to Quebec and Ontario, but it's actually part of the Qikiqtaaluk region of Nunavut. So the climate here is obviously cold as heck, and the average temperatures in the winter range from -10 degrees to -23 degrees Celsius, and in the summertime the average temperature is about 10 degrees Celsius, but there is a lot of rain, fog, wind, and overcast, and that is very common. To survive in an area like this, hunting is the number one key to living. It's the number one food source along with providing clothing and shelter. And so of course, living in this area, you're very dependable on the abundance of animals such as seals, walruses, fox, Arctic hare, beluga whales, birds, and fish. But on the plus side, the island has freshwater lakes and of course the salt water surrounding it. So it does give them access to a little bit of a broader range of fish and animals to hunt. So in the winter, the ice in this area becomes very thick, forming a really good platform for the people to travel. If I could give an example, if you've ever been to like Northern Ontario and have skated on the ice in the winter, it's like that. So that's what Hudson Bay turns into in the winter. And this allows the Inuit people to travel to the mainland, which we know as Quebec, to have a larger area to hunt. And the distance between the Belcher Islands and Quebec is about 130 kilometers. Another thing that they like to do on the mainland was trade and socialize at the Hudson Bay Trading Post, which was established in 1749. So they would often travel by sled dogs or kimmick, and something called a kamutik, which is a sled boat hybrid. And that would be in the winters, and in the summer they would use their kayaks. So around the mid-1800s, a permanent Christianity post was established on the Quebec side of Hudson Bay, which eventually translated the Bible into the Inuit language, and eventually the missionaries distributed this amongst the Inuits for them to read. Now, over the years, copies of this translated Bible ended up making its way to the people on the Belcher Islands, and of course they slowly began to read it. Now, I'm just going to plug this in right here. I just want to make it clear that the Inuit people traveled across Hudson Bay to Quebec to hunt and socialize and trade for a very long time, many years, well before the Hudson Bay seasonal trading post was established on the Belcher Islands, and that was in 1928. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of the sources I came across in this story painted the Belcher Island natives as people who never left the island, and they made it seem like they lived in solitude on this island for centuries. And I just want to make it clear that that's not exactly how things went. So I just want to make sure when you guys are doing your own research on this topic, please keep in mind that the people had been trading, socializing, and hunting and all that well before the 1900s. So continuing on. So like I said, the winters are extremely cold up there. And in the winter of 1940 to 1941, this was the most brutal winter they had ever seen. Along with extreme cold temperatures that they were not used to, Mother Nature decided to play a very cruel trick on the islanders. That winter, the animals, the bird, and the fish were very hard to come by. Winter in particular was already a difficult time to handle, but this winter in particular was unlike any other. In one of the small villages, the people did all they could just to get by physically and spiritually. And Angakok, which basically translates to shaman, is an important role to the Inuit people. And they cover a variety of practices, but not limited to healer, medicine man, a religious leader, a spiritual person, a communicator between worlds, as in our world and the spirit world. Now, the Inuits' belief system is that they believe everything in nature, from animals to people to wind, rocks, water, trees, all of it, they all have souls. And a soul could transfer from one being to another. And they also have their own gods as well. Now, there is so much more to this belief system, but I highly encourage you guys to look into it if you're interested in that kind of stuff, because I personally found it very interesting and actually so beautiful. So Charlie Oirak was the practicing Angakok for his village during that time of winter 1940-1941. He was a young man in his late 20s, a father of two, and he was said to have been a very energetic person that sincerely wanted to help his fellow villagers. So Charlie would often lead his village in rituals. So during that winter, a lot of the rituals were done in hopes of the gods bringing back the animals and the fish. Charlie reportedly dived into the ocean at one point in order to try and persuade the god Tekanakapsuk and mother of the animals to return the seals. He also arranged rituals in honor of Lord Sila to bring back the birds and the hares, but unfortunately all were unsuccessful and the winter continued to worsen. On the cold nights, the island people would often keep busy by reading the translated Bibles that had been brought to them in the years prior. Now, there was mixed information on this. There was mixed information on if there was multiple copies or if there was just one single copy, but I'm more inclined to believe that there was multiple copies. So a man named Peter Sala, who was 34 and who had a wife and children and was said to be the village's best hunter and ice navigator, was said to read the Bible to Charlie in a chant-like way. And oftentimes Charlie would fall down weak and just lay there as Peter would read him the Bible. Now, just being said like that, it sounds a little weird, but this wouldn't have necessarily been weird to the people around, since Angakoks were known to be easily affected by religious and spiritual things. So during that winter, Charlie and Peter slowly began to introduce Christianity into the original rituals. Charlie and Peter would often read the Bible to the villagers and uplifting visions of a new and fabulous life that was fast approaching, that would be free of hunting and fishing and working and hunger, which of course was all of the problems that the villagers were facing at that very moment in time. So Charlie interpreted Jesus as the white man's Angakok, and eventually around mid-January 1941, he declared himself as Jesus Christ, and he declared Peter Sala as God. So to convince this new narrative that Charlie was now Jesus and Peter was God to the village, Charlie and Peter used the old beliefs. They told the people that the spirit of Jesus had transferred into Charlie, and so he was now the new Jesus. Like I said, one of the beliefs was that souls could transfer from one being to another. So from what I can understand from researching, Charlie and Peter were still practicing rituals in the traditional way for the most part at this time in January of 1941. But during one of these rituals, an extraordinary meteor shower lit up the sky over the people of the Belcher Islands. Now, the villagers were horrified to see this sight and panicked, not knowing what was happening. But Charlie, on the other hand, was said to have fallen into a trance-like state and had no reaction to the events around him whatsoever. When Charlie finally came to, he told the tribe that the gods that the Inuit people were familiar with and who had known for many, many generations had all died and were no longer able to help them. It was also said that Charlie connected the meteor shower to a passage in the Bible. It was Matthew, and it said something like, "The stars will fall from the sky and you will see the Son of Man coming." And he took this to mean that the end of the world was near. I have no clue if that's the exact phrase that's in the Bible, but that's just what I picked up from my research. I'm in no way religious, so I'm really not too sure. Charlie preached that he was Jesus Christ, preparing the people for the other Jesus to come. And the wait for the return of Jesus was near its end, or the beginning of the end. A week after the meteor shower, on January 26th, the village gathered for their first ritual with the Christianity traditions. The first being the repentance to Jesus. This is where you confess your sins and such. So during this first ritual, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah Apaka spoke out against Peter and Charlie. "You are not Jesus, and you are not God. You are liars," Sarah exclaimed while pointing her finger at the two men. This enraged Charlie and Peter, of course, and also the believers. Sarah's brother, Alec Apokok, was completely devoted to Charlie and Peter at this point. While the crowd started to get worked up over what Sarah had said, Alec grabbed Sarah by the hair and hit her in the face with a wooden club. From what I gathered from sources, Charlie and Peter were shouting that they needed to find out if Sarah was good or wicked. And amongst the commotion of Sarah being attacked, a believer grabbed and lit a Primus stove, which is a portable kerosene stove or burner often used to cook with. The believer grabbed the Primus stove, which was lit, and held it close to Sarah's face. And when they did this, Charlie and Peter declared that Sarah was Satan. Of course, Sarah was crying out for help, but the believers just mercilessly beat her into unconsciousness. Sarah was then dragged out of the igloo into the snow, where a 17-year-old girl named Akinek hit her in the head with the end of a rifle and ended young Sarah's precious life then and there. Akinek entered back into the igloo with the others that had been outside with her, and it was said that she was delighted that Satan was gone. One man named Kitoyak, who was 47 years old, was horrified by what had happened to Sarah, and he confronted Charlie and Peter about it. Kitoyak told Peter and Charlie that their preaching needed to stop, but Charlie and Peter were not having any of this, and immediately declared Kitoyak the devil, and a fight broke out amongst the men. Kitoyak was lucky enough to break away from the fighting and run back to his igloo and hide. However, by the next morning, Charlie and Peter had enlisted another believer named Adeliko, and they set off to confront Kitoyak. They surrounded Kitoyak's igloo and began to torment him. Now, this next part is told differently depending on the sources. Some sources state that Peter, Charlie, and Adeliko entered Katowiak's igloo and beat him with a harpoon, finishing off with shooting him twice in the head. Other sources state that the men stayed outside of the igloo while tormenting him, and Peter threw a harpoon through the window at Katowiak, and then 2 shots were fired from a gun by Adlikok. Whichever version is correct, either way, Katowiak died a brutal and unnecessary death just because he defended another person's brutal and necessary death. 2 weeks after the death of Sarah and Katowiak, the religious group, which had by this time become a cult, traveled to another area of the Belcher Islands and joined up with another family. Charlie began to preach to them that he was Jesus Christ, and basically all the other stuff that he had told previously to his to get his people to follow him just weeks prior. Most of this new family ended up joining in with Charlie, Peter, and the followers. But let's not forget that there was next to no food this winter, which also means there was poorly made shelters, and they were probably extremely cold. Extreme hunger alone can cause hallucinations and psychosis. So just keeping that in mind, these people were extremely vulnerable at this time the religious cult showed up. So most of the family did begin to believe and join, all except for one. Alec Ekpuk was a 26-year-old man and a hunter, and was quite skeptical of everything and refused to accept the new Jesus and God. And on February 9th, Charlie and Alec broke out into an argument. During this argument, Alec turned away and began to walk away from Charlie. And of course, this just angered Charlie more, and he immediately declared Alec a devil. Charlie then turned to a man named Quarak, who had been absorbed into the cult, and ordered him to shoot Alec in the back. And Quarak did as he was told. But the saddest part about this killing was that Quarak had a tie to Alec. Alec was his son-in-law. Alec was shot in the back by his wife's father, which now brought the total killings up to 3. Now, at some point during all the religious excitement, it was hard to find exactly when this took place, but it was said that Charlie went around and killed all of these sled dogs. And he justified this senseless killing by saying that the gods told him to do so, and saying that there was no need for sled dogs at the end of the world. But now that the dogs were killed, not only was there no easy way to travel, but there was no easy way to escape even if they wanted to. It was said that after Charlie killed the sled dogs, this kind of woke Peter up a little bit, and he soon began to lose faith, even though he carried the title of God. He was smart enough, however, to not openly oppose Charlie and everything going on. Within a few weeks following the murder of Alec, a man named Ernest Riddle, who was the manager of a small Hudson Bay outpost on the Belcher Islands, recruited Peter Sala to guide him by dog sled on a regularly scheduled business trip to the larger Hudson Bay post at Great Whale River on the coast of Quebec. Once Peter got to this post, he was just riddled with guilt, and he ended up confiding in a Métis man named Harold Ungarden. He confessed of all the killings and everything that had happened back on the island. Harold then went and told Ernest Riddle everything that Peter had confided in him, and of course this just shocked Ernest. Like, he was on those islands. Why didn't he know what was going on? So Ernest immediately sent out a telegram to the RCMP headquarters in Ottawa, which read, 3 murders committed during an outbreak of religious fanaticism. Advise immediate investigation to prevent further outbreaks. But unknown to Ernest and Peter, their telegram was already too late. The journey for Peter and Ernest from the Belcher Islands to Quebec was a long trip. I'm not exactly sure how long this trip would have taken them, but I'm inclined to believe that it was a few days at least. While Peter was away, Charlie's 25-year-old sister named Mina decided that Peter being gone was the perfect time for her to take his place. It was said that Mina now said that she was Sister Mary, and the believers now needed to worship her as they did Charlie and Peter. Now, that part was actually only listed in some sources, so we don't know if that actually happened. But what we do know for certain is that sometime during the March of 1941, on a night that was said to have been negative 30 degrees, which is so cold that it can cause frostbite to exposed skin in under 30 minutes. That bone-chilling night, Mina fell into what we only can assume was a deep psychosis, and she was convinced that the world was ending that night. She ran around to each igloo, yelling that Jesus was coming to take the people to heaven, which is exactly what they were all waiting for. As she ran around and gathered the followers, which included the elderly and children, she brought them all onto the sea ice and forced them all to undress to meet their Savior completely nude. As the group stood there in the bitterly cold weather, waiting for their Savior, it didn't take long for a few of them to kind of snap out of it and get dressed and grab their children and dress them as well and run back to the igloos and hide. And amongst one of those women that were trying to get away from the ice sheet was Peter's wife named Anotelik, who was carrying a baby in her arms. As the group was beginning to come to their senses, she frantically tried to get her clothes on and dress some of her children. But when she tried to save her boy, Alec, she only managed to help him get his pants on before realizing that he was so cold that he couldn't even move. She heartbreakingly had to run back to her igloo with her other children, leaving Alec on the ice. And don't forget, she was holding a baby in her arms as well. By the time she was able to make it back to save him, it was unfortunately already too late. And to me, that is the most heartbreaking part of this entire story. 6 innocent people passed away on that ice that night. Charlie and Mina's 55-year-old mother, their 32-year-old sister, Peter's 8-year-old son Alec, a 13-year-old boy named Moses, a 7-year-old boy named Johnny, and a 6-year-old boy named Jonassy. Now, unfortunately, because this was 1941, World War II was in full bloom, which meant that basically any reliable aircraft was already sent off into the war. The RCMP had to take an old aircraft and rig it with spare parts that were left around to get the aircraft up and running. It took them till April 6th to do this, and then the RCMP left Ottawa to James Bay to meet up with the RCMP investigators and a coroner. It took them about 4 days to prepare and leave James Bay, and once they did, they left on skis and dog sleds. The RCMP group took about 6 days traveling the Belcher Islands and unraveling what went on that cold and brutal winter. They gathered the bodies of the victims and interviewed witnesses, gathered statements, examined the crime scenes, and just tried to put together an accurate timeline to understand what happened. The people of the islands never once hid what truly happened that winter, nor did any of them try to evade arrest. The RCMP group left the islands on April 16th by aircraft to the RCMP station in Moose Factory with their prisoners Charlie, Quarak, Adele Coke, and Mina. Traveling by aircraft for the first time ever, the prisoners were said to have been very wide-eyed and in awe of traveling through the air, which I could have only imagined. Like, it'd be wild to never have been in the sky and then suddenly be in the sky. And they were also really excited to see trees for the first time, which I can only imagine seeing that type of color. Like, I'm amazed by it every year. And another thing they were also excited for was to get 3 meals a day and a warm place to sleep. In prison, of course. So Ottawa kind of decided it would be a good idea to hold the trial on the Belcher Islands so that Ottawa was able to demonstrate, in their own words, the purpose and force of the Canadian justice system. The trials were made to be held on August 19th, and a white tent was set up and erected by the trading post on Tookarak Island, and they did their best to mimic the Canadian courtroom. They had a Canadian judge, and they also had 6 all-white male jury, of course, that was actually made up of 2 journalists that were attending the proceedings. the Hudson Bay Post manager, and 3 members of a geological prospecting party that just happened to be on the Belcher Islands at that time. And of course, they even had a picture of the Queen hung up behind the judge to look down on everyone in the courtroom. Pretty much anyone that could gathered to this makeshift tent courtroom thing to watch the proceedings. But unfortunately, pretty much every single one of them was sick with the flu. When the prisoners were brought back to Belcher Islands, they also brought back the flu, which they had all received while being held in Moose Factory. It was said that even one woman died of the result of receiving the flu. Now, like I said, Ottawa tried to make this trial a learning moment, but failed miserably. The whole event turned into one big spectacle, and in the end, even the prosecutor concluded that this show trial was a big mistake. And he even said that hanging the accused for murder would have absolutely no deterrent effect on the Inuit community. So Alec Apocock and Akinek were charged jointly for the murder of Sarah Apocock, but were both found not guilty due to temporary insanity. Alec was free to go, but Akinek was ordered to indefinite custody, and I'm not entirely sure why of that. Peter Sala and Adelikok were charged with the murder of Kitowiak, but were found guilty of manslaughter. Peter was sentenced to 2 years in jail, and Adelikok was sentenced to 1 year. Adlekok, not Adelikok, I'm sorry. Charlie Oyerak and Quarak were charged with the murder of Alec Ekpuk, but were both found guilty of manslaughter. Charlie was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but Quarak had a different sentence. He was actually allowed to stay on the Belcher Islands because he was a skilled hunter. So his sentence was that he required to provide meat to the families of the exiled men year-round. The exiled men's families were also all victims of the crimes. So this sentence was for the victims and not to be mistaken for comforting the prisoners. So Mina's charges and sentencing went a little differently as well, because she was actually diagnosed as insane, but she was still charged with the murder of 6-year-old Jonassy, who was chosen to represent the 6 that had died on the ice. But while Mina was in court, it was said that she was kicking and screaming and yelling and causing quite a scene, in the RCMP's words. And so she was obviously declared unfit to stand trial, and she was sentenced to indefinite custody, just like Akinek. All convicted and sentenced to serve time were sent to Moose Factory to live and work in exile at the RCMP compound. Charlie ended up contracting tuberculosis while in custody, and he actually ended up passing in May of 1942. Peter, Adlekok, Akinek, and Mina were all only in custody for 1 year, and then they were all released. They all moved up to Great Whale River under the supervision of the RCMP, and on the conditions that they never returned to the Belcher Islands. Peter's family ended up moving up to be with Peter following his release, and the following years, Peter was said to be a great hunter and navigator, and was actually even used as a boat pilot for some of the charters. But despite Peter and his family being together, it was a sad and isolated life. Marcosi, Peter's son, spoke of some of the difficulties that his family experienced while being in isolation in his testimony to the Kikiktani Truth Commission in 2010. He explained that because he grew up with no other people except for his family around, being around other people today really bothers him. Along with some other things he mentioned that if you guys are interested in, I have the link down below in my resources. At the end of Peter's life, him and some of his family did end up moving back to the Belcher Islands, but he was shunned by the community until his death not long after he had moved back. Later on in years, missionaries went to the Belcher Islands to try to baptize the Inuit and preaching of true love of God for all people. But of course, the people that survived that winter of 1940-1941 and went through that tragedy were extremely skeptical, understandably so, and quite standoffish of the white man's religion, and even consider it evil. And that, my friends, is the true tragedy of what happened in that cold winter of 1941 in the Belcher Islands. So, what thoughts does this historical story provoke in your mind? Do you think Peter and Charlie really were evil, or just desperate men that were greatly affected by the factors around them? Do you think the Canadian court system handled it properly? Do you think that the people of the island should have been the one to decide what justice was served? Do you think if religion wasn't a factor that winter, things would have gotten to the extremes that they did? Let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on this subject and discuss further with you guys. This was by far the hardest story for me to research and put together in a proper timeline. I've been hard at making this video for at least 3 weeks now, just trying to make sure that I get the most true timeline as possible while being respectful to the Inuit community. The one thing I want to say before I go is always do your own research and come to your own conclusions when listening to these stories. But most importantly, don't just listen to one source. There's always 2 sides to a story, and sometimes 3, 4, and even more. And the reason I specifically say this for this video is because if you do decide to do your own research, like I am encouraging, you will find that the tone and details at which this story is told is vastly different from one source to another. But as always, all of the sources that I have read, looked at, even opened are listed down below in the description box. And of course, I thank you so much for clicking on my video. And if you've made it this far and are still watching, why don't you click the subscribe button and ding that little notification bell so you're notified of my next unscheduled video. But that's all I have. Again, thanks so much and stay safe out there. Bye guys. It's getting dark again. I tried to film this early so that it wasn't getting dark like my last video,